The tea at Craven Hall was the finest event the county had seen that autumn, which meant that every person of consequence had arranged themselves in Lady Craven's drawing room by 3 o'clock, their good gloves on, their opinions already decided. The room smelled of hothouse flowers and warm beeswax, and the light came through tall windows onto silk cushions and painted porcelain and the sort of abundant stillness that money arranged for itself without effort. Dorothy stood near the tea table in her gray wool gown, not mourning, just sensible, just hers, and poured for Mrs. Aldridge's party and smiled at things she did not particularly feel, because that was what the afternoon required. She had been Countess of Renmore for 11 weeks. Lady Craven came to her in the lull between the first and second rounds of cake, moving with the practiced confidence of a woman who had never, in 50 years, arrived anywhere uninvited. She was beautifully dressed in dark gold silk with a topaz pendant at her throat, and her daughter Harriet trailed behind her in pale blue, which was, Dorothy had noted before, the color Lady Craven always chose for Harriet when she wished to make a point. The Baroness paused at Dorothy's elbow, as if by accident. "My dear Lady Renmore," she said, and the warmth in her voice had the quality of something precisely calibrated. "How very industrious you have been. I hear you have been visiting the tenant farms personally." "I have," Dorothy said. "How charming." Lady Craven lifted her teacup. "One does admire a woman who finds her occupation." She paused just long enough for Harriet to look away. "Though I wonder sometimes if the county understands the distinction. You have been gracious in your little efforts, I am sure. A county that has known Renmore Hall for 3 generations understands what is ornament and what is root." She set the cup down with a small, decisive click. "You are the cruel Lord's convenience, my dear, dressed in borrowed importance. They will be kind to you, for they are country people, and they are always kind, but they will not forget what brought you here." The room did not stop. The conversation continued around them in its polished way, teacups lifted and replaced, a laugh from the window seat where 2 young men were speaking to each other without listening. Dorothy did not look at Harriet, who was studying the floor with the expression of someone who has heard this before and has decided not to hear it again. "Thank you for the tea," Dorothy said. Her voice was level. "It is very good tea." She was still standing at that table, her hands quiet at her sides, when she heard the doors open at the far end of the room and felt the quality of the air change the way it changed when a large body of attention shifted its direction all at once. She did not turn immediately. She heard the conversation near the fireplace pause and then resume a half-note lower, and she heard Lady Craven's breath catch in a way that was almost imperceptible. William Hartley, Earl of Renmore, was not supposed to be at Lady Craven's tea. He did not take tea at Craven Hall. He did not, as a general matter, take tea anywhere he had not been specifically invited, and he had not been specifically invited here because Lady Craven had, Dorothy understood now, calculated that he would not attend. He was in riding clothes still, which meant he had come directly from the estate without changing, which meant he had known she was here, and had ridden the 4 miles to Craven Hall in November cold, without pausing to consider whether the gesture was appropriate. He crossed the room without greeting anyone. He stopped beside Dorothy and looked not at Lady Craven, but at the tea table, then at the gray wool gown, then at her face. "Come," he said. "Thomas has been asking for you." It was a lie. Thomas had been with Mrs. Poole in the nursery and had not asked for anyone. Dorothy knew it was a lie and understood, in the slow way she was learning to understand him, that it was not cruelty, but the only language he had for what he had seen from the doorway. She set down her cup and went with him. "If you have ever been called a name that was meant to define you, Stay close. This story belongs to you as much as it belongs to her. 3 months earlier, on a Wednesday in late August, Dorothy Ashton had stepped out of her brother Edmund's carriage in front of Wrenmore Hall and taken her first full look at the place that was to be her life. It was an old house, stone and serious, set into the hillside above a shallow river valley, with the kind of settled authority that buildings acquire only when they have outlasted several generations of disagreement about their purpose. The grounds were well kept. She had heard the estate was solvent, which meant the Earl was careful with money, which had been one of Edmund's more optimistic arguments. The roses near the gate were past their best, but had not been cut back, which meant either that the gardener had no instructions or that no one had thought to give them. She noted that without judgment and told herself that it was useful information. Edmund had not come inside with her. He had handed her bag to the footman and pressed her hand and said something about writing, and she had watched the carriage turn at the gate and felt the particular quality of being left that she had first learned when her father died, and that she recognized now as the niche her life seemed always to return to. She was 22 years old. She had been educated at her father's knee and had more Latin than most men she knew, and she had been arranged into this marriage like a piece of furniture moved from one room where it did not fit to another room where it might. The housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, had met her in the hall with a correct curtsy and a face that gave away nothing except competence. The footman had been stiff and careful. The house had the feel of a household in which people had learned to make themselves quiet, and Dorothy had recognized that feeling too. It was the feeling of a house where the person at the top was feared. She had not met Wrenmore until dinner. He was already in the dining room when she was brought in, standing at the window with his back to her. And he turned when she entered without the small social performance most men employed at introductions. No bow immediately, no pleasantry, just the direct assessment of a man reading a ledger entry. He was taller than she had expected. His face was all precision and controlled distance, the kind of face that had learned to give nothing away so thoroughly that the habit had become the face itself. He was not ugly. He was not anything she had a ready category for, which was its own problem. "Miss Ashton," he said. "My lord," she said. "Dorothy," he said, as if trying the word for weight. "I am told you read in several languages." "French and Latin," she said, "and a little Greek, though my Greek is rusty." "You may use the library," he said. "The hours are your own. I ask only that you do not rearrange the shelves, as I have a system." It was not, she reflected later, the worst possible beginning. It was also not a beginning at all. He had sat at the far end of a table set for 30, and they had eaten in near silence, and he had asked her 3 more questions: her preference in weather, whether she rode, what she thought of the continent. She had answered each one carefully, and he had listened to each answer with the full attention of a man who was genuinely gathering information. And at the end of dinner, he had said, "Good night," and gone, and she had sat alone in the big room with the candles burning down, and understood that she was going to have to build something here from the ground up, or she was going to disappear inside this house, like a piece of furniture pushed against the wrong wall. She had decided, between the fish course and the dessert, that she did not intend to disappear. The county's opinion of the Earl of Wrenmore had been made available to Dorothy within her first week, offered in the gentle, unstoppable way that country communities offer their verdicts to newcomers, delivered with sympathy and lowered voices by women who genuinely wished her well and could not conceive of keeping the information back. Mrs. Aldred, the vicar's wife, had come to call on her 4th day and had said, with kind caution, that the Earl was not a man given to warmth, and that the village still felt the loss of the families he had turned out when he inherited. The village had felt it, Mrs. Aldred said carefully, for 3 years. 14 families. No references given, No consideration paid, no explanation offered. Dorothy had drunk her tea and listened and asked quiet questions and understood, from what was said and from what was not, that the county had decided Renmore was cruel and had been deciding this for 3 years, and that her arrival had been received with the particular sympathy the county reserved for animals placed in poor conditions. She was not an animal in a poor condition. She was a woman making an inventory. Within her first fortnight, she had introduced herself to Mrs. Poole, not as the Countess demanding an accounting, but as a person who had arrived new to a large household and needed to understand how it ran. Mrs. Poole, who had clearly been braced for something worse, thawed slowly across 3 mornings in the housekeeper's room, and by the end of the 3rd had shown Dorothy the household accounts with the manner of someone laying evidence before a magistrate. The accounts were orderly. Every expenditure was precise and defensible and cold. She had walked the estate before the end of the 1st week, alone except for a footman who trailed her at a respectful distance and pretended not to notice where she stopped or what she wrote in the small notebook she carried. The tenant farms were sound, but not warm. The roofs were kept. The walls were maintained. The tenants touched their hats to her and watched her with the careful neutrality of people who had learned that this house's interest in them was accounting-shaped, not personal. She wrote down everything. She did not show it to Renmore. She met Thomas on the 9th day, when she lost her way in the east wing and found herself in the corridor outside the nursery, and heard someone on the other side of the door reading a story aloud to himself in a small, determined voice, getting the harder words wrong and correcting them and going on. She knocked. There was a silence, and then the door opened, and Thomas Hartley looked up at her with his father's directness and his father's careful face and something else underneath it, something young and unguarded that had not yet learned to be kept back. "You are the new lady," he said. "I am," she said. "What are you reading?" He held the book up. It was a natural history, the illustrations beautifully detailed, and he had been attempting, she saw, to read the Latin names beneath the pictures. She came inside. She sat on the low chair by the window and read him the Latin names and what they meant in plain English, and he listened with the focused attention of someone collecting useful things, and neither of them mentioned that she had not been invited, or that this was a departure from the household's usual quiet discipline. On the mantelpiece there was a small painted wooden horse. It was old, the paint worn smooth at the mane and the hindquarters, and it sat slightly apart from the other objects on the shelf, as if it had been placed with care rather than set down casually. She did not ask about it. She looked at it for a moment and looked away. When she rose to go, Thomas said, without looking up from the book, "You may come back." She did. By October, the county had begun to notice what Dorothy was doing, which was not, as Lady Craven would suggest, a performance. It was not organized charity or calculated philanthropy. It was the same competence she had brought to the household accounts applied to the visible needs around her, which were real and specific and addressable if one was willing to address them. The Hayward farm had lost its eldest son to the spring fever, and old Mrs. Hayward could not manage the harvest kitchen alone. Dorothy went on 2 Tuesdays and 1 Thursday. She did not tell anyone she went. She went because Mrs. Hayward needed help, and she could provide it, and there was no sensible reason not to. She came home both mornings with her hem damp and her hands smelling of wood smoke, and felt for the first time since arriving that she had spent her hours usefully. The 4 children at the Ridley farm had no instruction since the village school closed 2 years prior. Dorothy organized twice-weekly reading at the church hall, wrote to Mrs. Aldred, who organized it properly, and arrived on the appointed mornings with her Latin dictionary and a patience for error that she had learned from her father. The children came. Then more children came. Then some of the mothers came and sat at the back and listened, which Dorothy took as information about their own absent education, and began to address quietly and without comment. The cold arrived in the 3rd week of October with a speed that the county had not expected, and Dorothy made an accounting of the families on the Wren Moor estate, whose fuel stores were insufficient, and organized deliveries through the estate's own supply, drawing from the surplus she had identified in the first week's inventory without, technically, exceeding her household authority. She had not asked Wren Moor's permission. She had not hidden what she did. She had done it, and noted it in the household accounts in a single line, and waited. He did not object. He also did not acknowledge it. They ate dinner together 4 nights of 7, and the conversation was not cold, but it was bounded, kept within the perimeter of estate business and the weather, and one night a long and surprisingly engaged exchange about the geology of the valley that Dorothy had not known he cared about until he mentioned the chalk beds with the small, precise enthusiasm of a man who had been attending to something quietly for a long time. She had not known what to do with that enthusiasm. She had asked another question, and he had answered it, and they had sat at the long table in the candlelight with the autumn dark outside the windows and talked about chalk. And it had been, she did not know the right word for it, less lonely than she was accustomed to. He found her in the library on the last day of October. She was reading at the table near the window, a volume of botanical essays she had been working through for a week, and he came in without announcement, which was his way, and crossed to the shelves without looking at her, and took down a volume, and stood for a moment at the shelf with his back to her. "The Hayward delivery," he said. "Yes," she said. "There were 3 others that week." "4," she said. "I miscounted initially." He was quiet for a moment. "The Ridley children," he said. "Mrs. Aldred manages the formal organization," she said. "I only assist." He turned from the shelf. He looked at her across the length of the room, the way he sometimes looked at her, with the directness that had no social buffer in it, just attention. His eyes moved to the mantelpiece and to the small painted horse, and then back to her face. "Thomas showed you that," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "I noticed it on my first visit. He has not mentioned it." Something in his face shifted. It was very small, a brief loosening in the jaw, a change in the quality of the stillness. He looked at the horse for a moment longer. "It was his mother's," he said. "She gave it to him before she died." He paused. He was 2 years old. He does not remember her. He knows it is important without knowing why. "That is a particular kind of grief," Dorothy said carefully. "Yes," he said. Then after a silence, he said, "The accounts for October. You have kept them well." He replaced the book on the shelf, though she had not seen him open it, and left. "If you are still with us in this quiet room, leave a word below. We will read every one." 2 weeks after the library conversation, on a morning when the first serious frost had come overnight, and the lane between the hall and the village was white with it, Dorothy pulled on her heaviest wool and walked to Mrs. Hayward's farm with a basket of provisions from the kitchen. It was not a long walk. She did it often enough that the path was becoming familiar. The way paths become familiar when they are used with purpose and not merely observed. She was standing in the Hayward dooryard, laughing at something the old woman had said about a goat and the frost. Genuinely laughing, her gloved hand at the woman's arm, when she felt the particular awareness she had developed of eyes on her from a specific direction. She did not turn immediately. She let the laughter finish and set the basket down inside the door, and spoke for a moment more with Mrs. Hayward. and when she turned at last, the lane was empty. The boot prints in the frost were a man's, made by a good riding boot, and they stopped at the edge of the lane nearest the Hayward gate, and did not come inside the yard, and then turned back the way they had come. She walked home in the cold, and did not mention it. That evening, before dinner, she found Thomas in the library again. He had been attempting the botanical essays, holding the book at an angle that suggested he had dragged it from the shelf she had been reading from, which meant he had been watching which shelf she favored. She sat with him. She read him the section about primroses because they were the simplest and the most beautiful, and they were in the middle of the illustration when the door opened. Renmore stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the two of them, the low lamplight and the book open between them and Thomas, leaning into her arm with the uncalculated trust of a child who has decided someone is safe. His face did what it rarely did. It did not close. He stood in the opening of the door and looked at them, and was briefly, entirely unguarded, and Dorothy felt the pulse of that openness in her own chest before he composed himself and stepped inside. "Thomas," he said, his voice level, "it is past your hour." "She was reading me The Primrose," Thomas said. "You may continue tomorrow," Renmore said. "Mrs. Poole is waiting." Thomas went, with the book tucked under his arm, and a look at his father that contained, Dorothy thought, more understanding than a 5-year-old should have needed. Renmore stood at the door until the boy's footsteps faded on the corridor, and then came to the chair his son had vacated, and sat down. He did not sit the way he usually sat, at the far end of the room's distance. He sat in the chair Thomas had been in, which was the chair beside hers. "His mother died of a fever," he said, without preamble. "The year before I inherited." Dorothy waited. The same fever came for Thomas 2 summers past. He set his hands on the arms of the chair, a deliberate arrangement that she had learned meant he was managing something that did not want to be managed. "I was in London. I had been in London for 3 weeks, settling the question of the staff, which my father had left in disorder, and which I had determined to address." He paused. The nursemaid who first recognized how ill Thomas was had been among the staff I had already dismissed. She came back nevertheless. She came back without pay or position, and she sat with him for 4 days while I rode from London. Dorothy did not move. By the time I arrived, the crisis had passed. His voice was controlled in a way that cost something. He was small and pale in a large bed, and the nursemaid, whose name was Ellen Marsh, was asleep in the chair beside him because she had not left it in 4 days. He looked at his hands. I had dismissed her without a reference. She came back. She did not do it for me. She did it because she loved Thomas, and because that was the kind of person she was, and I had not known it because I had never looked. "Where is she now?" Dorothy said. "I found her a position," he said. "A good one in Bath. I wrote the reference myself." He was quiet for a moment. "I made the other dismissals right as I could. Some had found positions. Some had not. I did what I could." He looked at her directly. "It was not enough. The county knows what I did, and does not know what I did afterward. And I have not seen a reason to explain myself to the county. I am not certain I deserve to." The fire had burned low. Outside, the frost was settling deeper into the valley. "The wooden horse," Dorothy said. "Thomas does not remember his mother," he said. "He carries the horse because I told him she gave it to him, and he believes that because I have told him so. He has not yet asked why there is only the horse." He stopped. "I do not know what I will tell him when he asks." "The truth," Dorothy said, made gentle. "He is old enough to hold it if it is held carefully." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, You are not what I expected." She did not know what to say to that. She said nothing. "Sleep well," he said, and rose and left. And the fire went on burning its low red way toward morning. November came and deepened, and the county's warmth toward Dorothy was by now an established fact, which made it the kind of fact that could be gathered and used. Lady Craven was a woman of considerable intelligence, and she had been gathering it for weeks, storing observations like provisions against a winter she had been predicting since August, namely that the marriage between the Ashton girl and Renmore would dissolve of its own inadequacy, and that when it did, her daughter Harriet would be positioned to step into the vacancy with the natural ease of someone who had always been the correct answer. What Lady Craven required was a lever, and Edmund Ashton arrived in the county on a Thursday and provided one. Dorothy did not know he was coming. She found out when Mrs. Poole came to her in the morning room with the particular expression of a woman delivering unwelcome news she had already begun to measure the consequences of, and said that Mr. Ashton had arrived and was in the study with his lordship. Dorothy set down her pen. She smoothed her gown. She went to the study. What she found when she reached the hall was not the closed study door she had expected, but the sound of voices. Her brother's voice, pitched to persuasion, Lady Craven's voice, which she had not expected, and Renmore's voice, which was entirely flat and entirely controlled in the way it was when he was managing something he considered beneath his attention. She stood in the corridor and listened. Edmund was saying something about the terms of the marriage agreement and the question of coercion, which was a lie polished to a finish, and Lady Craven was adding in her measured way that Dorothy had been making a spectacle of the Renmore name through her charitable performances, which was also a lie, and that the match had been a disadvantage to the earldom from the beginning, which was simply Lady Craven's long-held opinion submitted as evidence. Renmore said nothing for a long moment. Dorothy pressed her hand flat against the wall and waited. "They call you the cruel Lord's convenience even in the city, Dora," Edmund had told her 2 days ago in the parlor, before she understood why he had come, before she understood that this visit was not a brother's concern, but a negotiation. "You are an object of pity to every person of consequence. Come home. I will find you another arrangement. This one was a mistake." She had looked at him and understood something she had been understanding slowly for weeks. Edmund had not made a mistake. He had made a calculation, and the calculation had been about Edmund, and she had been the commodity transferred. And here was the same calculation submitted again, in a study down the hall, dressed in legal language about coercion and propriety. Renmore's voice came from the study. "You will leave this house." His voice was not loud. It was the tone she had heard once when a footman had misspoken in front of Thomas, low and final and completely without heat, which was somehow worse than anger. "My lord," Lady Craven began. "You will leave this house," Renmore said again, "and you will not return to it, either of you, without my express invitation, which I do not anticipate extending." There was a silence. Then the sound of chairs. Dorothy returned to the morning room. She sat down at her desk. She did not pick up her pen. She stared at the paper in front of her and felt the particular cold clarity of a woman who has been moved around a board her whole life and is looking at the square she is currently occupying and wondering whether the piece that holds it has been defended or merely not yet taken. He had sent them away. He had not consulted her. He had not, as far as she had heard, said anything about her at all. He had said only, "Leave this house," which was his house, and the dismissal had been territorial rather than particular. She did not know what that meant. She was afraid to decide what it meant. She began quietly to consider what she would take if she left. She did not pack. She sat in the morning room until dinner was announced, and went to the table and found Renmore already at his place, and sat down, and did not look at her hands, and ate what she could manage. He said, across the distance of the table, "You heard." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Edmund Ashton is not a man whose estimation of you ought to carry weight with you," he said. "It carries none with me." She looked at him. He was watching her with the direct attention she had learned to read as the closest thing he had to tenderness. "What Lady Craven said," she began. "Lady Craven," he said, "has wanted this match for her daughter since before my wife died, and has been disappointed 3 years running. Her opinion of you is the opinion of a woman protecting a position she was never offered." He reached for his wine glass and did not lift it. "You have made this county warmer than I have managed in 6 years of residence. I have observed it. I have observed you. I know what you are." He paused. "I know what you are not." Dorothy set her fork down very carefully. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. "And the marriage," she said. "Is a marriage," he said. "It was made. It stands. That is what I told them, and that is what is true." He looked at her directly. "What you make of it beyond that is, as I understand it, still being determined. By both of us." There was nothing more said on the subject that night. She went to bed, and lay in the dark, and thought about the wooden horse and the frost on the lane, and the specific quality of his face in the library doorway when he had not yet known she was watching him watch Thomas. And she allowed herself, for the first time, to feel something that was not resignation. The Harvest Assembly was the last great gathering of the county before Christmas, held in the assembly rooms in the market town 3 weeks after Edmund's departure, and everyone came. Lady Craven came, because Lady Craven always came. Harriet came in pale blue, which had by now taken on the particular significance of a recurring argument. Mr. Finch came, and the Ridley family, and Mrs. Aldred with the vicar, and a dozen families Dorothy had met in the Tennant Farms and the church hall and the Hayward dooryard. They arrived before the Renmore carriage. When she came in on Renmore's arm, they turned, in the way rooms turn, and she understood from the quality of the turning that she had become someone to the county, even if she was not yet certain what. Mrs. Aldred caught her eye from across the room and inclined her head with the small, warm gravity of a woman acknowledging a thing done right. The children from the church hall were not there, being too young for assemblies, but their mothers were. And 2 of them smiled at Dorothy with the particular warmth of people who have decided to be glad you exist. Lady Craven moved to intercept them near the door. She was in gold again, the topaz pendant. Harriet was not with her this time. "Lord Renmore," she said. "Lady Renmore." The pause before Dorothy's title was very small and precisely placed. "I had not expected to see you both this evening. We attend every year," Renmore said. "Of course." Lady Craven smiled at Dorothy. "And how is your little project at the church hall progressing? I hear the mothers have been attending." She said it the way one mentions a thing that is charming and irrelevant, a pastime. "How very devoted you have been. A convenience, one might say, for the families who could not otherwise afford instruction." The word she had chosen was not accidental. Dorothy heard it land in its intended place and held herself very still. Around them, the room had not stopped, but had adjusted, the way rooms adjust to something happening at their center, conversations continuing at a half-pitch lower, faces not turned but angled. Mrs. Aldred was 3 people away. Mr. Finch was at the fireplace, old Mrs. Hayward was beside the punch bowl, and Dorothy had not known the old woman came to assemblies, but she had come, and she was looking directly at Lady Craven with an expression that was not quite readable from across the room. Renmore had gone still at Dorothy's side. She felt the stillness in the arm under her hand, the quality of attention that gathered itself before something was decided. Lady Craven was still speaking. "One does admire the effort, truly. A county that has known Renmore for 3 generations. Renmore stepped forward. It was not a large movement. 3 steps, placing himself between Dorothy and Lady Craven in a clean, unhurried way that was neither aggressive nor deferential. Simply the movement of a man who has calculated exactly where he needs to stand. "Lady Craven," he said. The room had gone quiet in that particular way. "I'm going to say one thing," he said, and his voice was the level carrying voice he used when he wished to be heard and not interrupted. "It will require no response from you." Lady Craven's chin came up a 1/4 inch. "My wife chose this county," he said, into the held silence of the assembly room. "I chose her. That is all." The room did not burst into sound. It did something slower and more complete, a collective breath released, a shift of weight from one foot to another, the small bodily adjustments of people who have arrived at an understanding. Mrs. Hayward put down her punch cup and nodded as if confirming a thing she had known before it was said. Mr. Finch, at the fireplace, turned to look at Dorothy with the expression of a man recalibrating an entry in a ledger. Lady Craven did not fragment. She was a woman of too much control for fragmentation. She stood with her topaz pendant and her gold silk and her careful smile, and she looked at Dorothy, and something passed across her face that was not quite humility, but was adjacent to it, the recognition of a position she had miscalculated. She looked at her daughter Harriet, who had arrived after all, standing near the door in pale blue, and Harriet looked back at her mother with the expression of a young woman who has been positioned as an answer to a question that has now been asked and answered differently. "Lord Renmore," Lady Craven said, and the precision of her voice had changed, gone from instrument to simply voice. "Lady Renmore." She inclined her head. She turned and moved back toward the room's perimeter. Dorothy stood in the center of the assembly room with the candlelight on her gray wool gown and the county's eyes on her. And she did not triumph. She was not built for triumph. She felt only the strange, warm clarity of being accurately seen by someone whose seeing she had come to value, and the knowledge that the county was looking at her, not with pity, but with the particular warm recognition of people watching something they had already understood before it was said aloud. Renmore returned to her side. He did not take her arm in the old, careful, formal way. He offered his hand, palm up, and waited. She placed her hand in his. They danced. They were not brilliant at it, for he was too deliberate, and she was out of practice. But they were present to each other in a way that was not formal, and Mrs. Aldred watched them from the edge of the floor and said something to the vicar that made him smile, and old Mrs. Hayward drank her punch and watched with the proprietary satisfaction of a woman whose opinion had been borne out by events. December came fast that year, with early snow that softened the valley and made the stone house at the top of the hill look like something from a mezzotint, the kind of image that is more real than reality. The library fireplace was the warmest room in the house, and they had taken to spending evenings in it, the 3 of them, Dorothy at the table with her reading, Renmore in the wing chair with the estate correspondence, Thomas on the hearthrug with whatever book he had claimed from the lowest shelf. The chalk beds had led to other things. They were partway through a correspondence with a geologist in Edinburgh that had begun as Renmore's private inquiry and had quietly extended to include Dorothy's observations from her estate walks. He had shown her the map with the survey marks without comment, and she had added 3 notes in pencil, and he had looked at the additions for a long moment and said, "The 3rd observation. How did you see it?" "I looked down," she said. He had laughed. It was the second time she had heard him laugh. The first had been at Thomas, quietly, over a mispronounced word, and it was not a large sound, but it was entirely real, and she felt it settle into the room like heat from the fire. On the evening of the 20th of December, Thomas came into the library carrying the wooden horse. He carried it with the careful, two-handed gravity of someone transporting something important, and he crossed the hearthrug and stood in front of Dorothy and held it out. "Mrs. Poole said Mama gave it to me," he said. "Papa told me so too. He said she loved horses." He looked at the horse, considering. "I thought maybe you would like to keep it on your table, because you came here." Dorothy looked at the small painted horse in his hands, its mane worn smooth, its hindquarters rubbed to bare wood by a generation of small holding hands. She felt Renmore's stillness from across the room, and did not look at him yet. "That is very generous of you," she said, her voice steady. "You can give it back when I am old enough to not need it," Thomas said reasonably. She took the horse and set it on the corner of her table. Thomas looked satisfied and returned to his hearthrug and his book. Renmore was watching her from his chair, and when she met his eyes, she found them unguarded in the way they had been in the library doorway months ago, the look that was not performance. "Dorothy," he said. Her name in his voice, which he had only used once before, and quietly, and she had not forgotten it. "Yes," she said. "Come and sit here," he said, and moved the papers from the table at his arm to make room, which was as close as he knew how to come to saying everything else. She moved her chair to his side of the fireplace, where the light was warmer, and they sat through the long December evening with the snow falling outside the tall windows, and the boy asleep on the hearthrug at their feet, and the small wooden horse standing on the edge of her table, and the fire going on with its steady red work, and none of them were alone. Thank you for staying until the end. If Dorothy's story found you, leave a word below. She was never the cruel Lord's convenience. She was simply the first person who looked clearly at what was there.